Randall Starcher, step away from the aircraft and keep your hands where I can see them.
Sure. What's this about?
We need to...
Randall Starcher dedicated years to earning his pilot's license and building a life in the sky. The very skill that made him valuable to a drug smuggling operation is the reason federal agents are standing in front of him right now.
We need to talk about several flights between South Texas and Central Florida.
I flew plenty of trips. You're going to have to be more specific.
He would not get the chance to explain. Within 72 hours, federal agents from Homeland Security Investigations would seize his Cessna, his hangar records, his fuel receipts, and a stack of handwritten flight logs that documented every trip between South Texas and Central Florida for almost 2 years. 10 round trips, roughly 500 pounds of marijuana per flight. One pilot, one plane, and a deal where the plane paid for itself. This is the story of Randall C. Starcher, a 44-year-old licensed pilot from Kissimmee, Florida, whose private aircraft was both the tool of the crime and the payment for committing it. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who had a job that opened doors most people never get to walk through? A pilot, a long-haul driver, a customs broker, somebody who moves across borders and checkpoints like the rules bend around them. Drop a comment and tell me about it. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. We cover the cases where that kind of access gets weaponized, and we don't let them get buried. Randall Clayton Starcher was born in October of 1967 in St. Cloud, Florida, a small ranching town just southeast of Kissimmee that still smelled like cattle feed and orange blossom in the same breath. His father, Donald Starcher, was an aircraft mechanic at a small fixed-base operator on the field at Kissimmee Gateway Airport. His mother, Linda, worked the front desk at a Holiday Inn off Highway 192, the road that fed tourists toward the gates of Walt Disney World, 12 miles to the west. Donald Starcher had hands that always smelled like Avgas and a wallet that was always thin. He worked on Cessnas and Pipers and the occasional Beechcraft for charter outfits that ran tourists out over the Bahamas. He came home with grease in the creases of his knuckles and stories about pilots who flew themselves into ruin and pilots who flew themselves into fortune. Randall grew up hearing both. The boy spent his weekends at the airport. By the time he was 9 years old, he could name every aircraft on the ramp by tail number. By 12, he was riding his bicycle the 4 miles from his family's clapboard house to the airfield to wash down wings and sweep out hangars for pocket money. The line crew tolerated him because his father was a good mechanic and because the kid never asked questions he wasn't supposed to ask. He simply watched. He watched how a flight plan got filed at the FBO desk. He watched how a private pilot could fuel up at one small airport, lift off, and land at another small airport 6 states away with nobody in a uniform ever looking inside the cabin. He graduated from Osceola High School in 1985. His yearbook listed him as a member of the Aviation Club and the Auto Shop Club. The senior quote under his photograph read, "Heading west to find some sky." He did not go to college. He went instead to Daytona Beach, where he enrolled in a 1-year flight school program operated out of a small leaseback hangar at the city's general aviation field. He worked nights driving a fuel truck to pay tuition. He earned his private pilot certificate in the spring of 1987, and his commercial certificate 18 months after that. His first paying job in aviation came in 1989, towing advertising banners over the beaches of Daytona and New Smyrna in the summer tourist season. The work was low altitude, low paying, and exhausting. He flew a tired Piper Pawnee with a tow hook welded to the tail, dragging banners that read, "All you can eat crab legs, exit 87 and join the Navy." He earned about $250 a week. By 1992, he had moved up. He took a job as a charter pilot for a small operator running tourists from Orlando out to the Florida Keys and over to Bimini in the Bahamas. He flew a Cessna 402 and a Beechcraft Baron. He was 25 years old, single, and untethered. His evaluations from those years described him with the kind of language small aviation outfits use about the pilots they cannot afford to lose. Reliable in marginal weather. treats customers with patience, completes paperwork without prompting. One supervisor wrote that Starcher had the temperament of a much older man. It was meant as a compliment. He married a woman named Karen Whitfield in 1994. She was a dental hygienist from St. Cloud. They bought a 3-bedroom ranch house in a subdivision in Kissimmee for $61,000. They had 2 children, a son in 1996 and a daughter in 1999. But the charter business soured. The owner sold the operation in 2001 after the September attacks gutted general aviation tourism for 2 years. Randall Starcher floated through 3 jobs in 5 years. He flew a Cessna 208 Caravan for a cargo outfit that hauled bank documents overnight between Tampa and Atlanta. He flew aerial survey runs for a real estate appraisal company. He flew a flight instruction route at a school in Sanford that closed in 2006 when the owner declared bankruptcy. By 2008, Starcher was 41 years old. He had a mortgage that was underwater after the Florida housing crash. He had a son in middle school and a daughter in elementary school. He had a credit card balance that he could not pay down and a wife who had taken a second job answering phones at a dental clinic at night to keep the family solvent. He still had his pilot's certificates and his medical and almost 2,000 hours of flight time. But he could not find steady work, and the work he found did not pay the bills. That was the man a smuggling operation was looking for. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how private aviation actually works in the United States, and why it has been, for decades, one of the softest seams in the country's border enforcement fabric. There are over 5,000 public-use general aviation airports in the United States. Many of them are small grass strips with a single runway, a fuel pump, a chain-link fence, and an unattended office building with a soda machine and a flight planning computer. A licensed pilot in a private aircraft can take off from one of these airports and land at another one 1,000 miles away without ever speaking to a human being other than air traffic control on the radio, and even that contact is optional for flights conducted under visual flight rules outside controlled airspace. There is no TSA checkpoint at a general aviation field. There is no luggage screening. There is no customs inspection for a domestic flight, no matter how far it travels, no matter what state line it crosses, no matter what is in the cabin. A pilot files a flight plan if he wants to. He pays for his fuel with a credit card or with cash, and he keeps the receipt or he doesn't. The aircraft itself is registered with the Federal Aviation Administration, but the registration system is concerned with airworthiness and ownership, not with cargo. Federal law enforcement has known about this vulnerability since at least the late 1970s, when small aircraft smuggling out of Colombia and the Bahamas helped build the cocaine trade. The DEA and the Customs Service responded with radar tracking, with informant networks, with seizures and indictments. But the volume of legitimate general aviation flights in the United States, roughly 24 million takeoffs per year, meant that any given flight, even a long-distance one, was statistically invisible. To catch a smuggler in the air, you had to be looking for that exact pilot, at that exact time, on that exact route. Otherwise, the flight simply was not flagged. What investigators did instead was build cases on the ground. They watched fuel purchases. They watched tail numbers turn up repeatedly at airports that had no obvious business reason for that aircraft to be there. They cultivated informants inside trafficking organizations. They subpoenaed bank records and looked for cash purchases of aircraft. They waited for the pattern to surface, and then they hit hard. A Cessna 206 is one of the most common single-engine, high-wing private planes in American aviation. It is a 6-seat aircraft designed in the early 1960s with a useful load of roughly 1,400 pounds and a range of about 700 miles between refueling stops. It is rugged, simple, and unremarkable. There are thousands of them on the registry. A used one in good condition, in 2009, sold for somewhere between $50,000 and $90,000, depending on hours and condition. A pilot could buy one with cash from a private seller and never trigger a single regulatory question, because cash sales of aircraft were, and largely still are, legal and common. The Cessna 206 had one other quality that made it valuable to the people who wanted to use it for something other than flying photographers over beach houses. The cabin behind the front two seats could be reconfigured. The rear seats were removable. With those seats out, you had a roughly 70 cubic foot cargo bay, accessible through a double clamshell door on the right side. That cargo bay could hold, comfortably and without being visible from outside the aircraft, somewhere between 400 and 600 pounds of compressed vegetation, wrapped in plastic and duct tape. That is the system Randall Starcher understood. It is the system he had grown up around. It is the system that, in 2008, somebody offered to pay him to exploit. The co-conspirator was a man named Jeffrey Boswell, a 47-year-old Central Florida resident with prior connections to a marijuana distribution network that sourced product from South Texas brokers, who in turn sourced from Mexican suppliers across the Rio Grande. Boswell needed a pilot. He had spent the previous 18 months looking for one. He had been introduced to Starcher in the late summer of 2008 by a mutual acquaintance who knew that Starcher was struggling financially and that Starcher held a clean commercial pilot's certificate. The first conversations were not about marijuana. They were about money. Boswell told Starcher that he had a business proposition involving the transportation of agricultural products on a recurring schedule, and that the work paid significantly better than charter flying. Starcher, by his own later admission to investigators, did not ask many questions in those early meetings. He listened. He went home and looked at his unpaid mortgage statement and the balance on the second job his wife had taken. He came back to the next meeting prepared to ask different questions. By the spring of 2009, the arrangement had crystallized. Boswell and Starcher would jointly purchase a private aircraft. They identified a 1976 Cessna 206 advertised in a regional aviation classified, sitting on a tie-down at an airfield outside Lakeland. The asking price was $68,000. Boswell brought the cash to the transaction in a brown leather attaché case. He paid the entire amount in $100 bills. The previous owner, a retired dentist, counted the money on the hood of his pickup truck and signed the bill of sale to a shell entity Boswell had registered 3 weeks earlier. Starcher's stake in the aircraft was not paid in cash. It was paid in flights. The deal was that Starcher would pilot the Cessna 206 on smuggling runs between South Texas and Central Florida, and a portion of each delivery's payment would be credited against his half of the purchase price. The arrangement meant that Starcher had no upfront financial exposure. It also meant that every flight he made was, in the most literal sense, paying down the asset that was being used to commit the crime. The first flight took place in late May of 2009. Starcher departed Kissimmee Gateway Airport at first light, climbed to 7,500 feet, and tracked west across the Florida Panhandle. He fueled at a small public airfield in southern Mississippi. He fueled again at a private strip outside Houston. He continued southwest until he landed at a remote agricultural airstrip near Falfurrias, Texas, about 60 miles north of the Mexican border. He waited overnight in a rented room above a feed store. The next morning, before dawn, a pickup truck arrived at the airstrip and 2 men loaded approximately 500 pounds of marijuana, vacuum sealed in plastic and packed into cardboard boxes, into the cabin of the Cessna behind the pilot's seat. Starcher took off at sunrise and tracked east. He made 2 fuel stops on the return leg. He landed at a small, unattended grass strip in Central Florida that Boswell had arranged for as a drop point. The cargo was unloaded into a waiting box truck within 15 minutes of touchdown. Starcher flew the empty plane back to Kissimmee that same afternoon and tied it down on the public ramp like he had been out doing pattern work. He was paid $8,000 in cash for that first round trip. $5,000 of it was credited against his share of the airplane. $3,000 he kept. The pattern repeated. Across the remainder of 2009 and through 2010, Starcher flew the Cessna 206 on at least 10 documented round trips between South Texas and Central Florida. The routes varied. Sometimes he went through Louisiana, sometimes through Alabama, sometimes through northern Mexico airspace, and then north across the Rio Grande into Texas. He used different fuel stops on different runs. He paid for fuel sometimes in cash, sometimes with a credit card that Boswell had set up under the shell entity's name. He kept handwritten records of every leg in a small spiral-bound notebook he stored in the map pocket of the plane. Each flight carried roughly 500 pounds of marijuana. Across 10 flights, that is approximately 5,000 pounds of product moved into Central Florida distribution channels. At the wholesale rates prevailing in 2009 and 2010, the cargo value of each flight was somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000, depending on quality and the broker's margin. Across all 10 flights, the operation moved between $4 and $6 million in marijuana. Starcher's personal cut, by his own later statements, came to roughly $40,000 in retained cash on top of the equity he was building in the aircraft. His wife noticed the new cash. He told her he had picked up extra hours flying agricultural survey work for a private buyer. She did not ask follow-up questions. She used the money to catch up on the mortgage and to enroll their daughter in a private dance program in St. Cloud. By the late fall of 2010, Starcher had paid off his entire share of the Cessna 206. The plane was his, or, more precisely, the plane was jointly his and Boswell's, with title held by the shell entity. Starcher began discussing with Boswell the possibility of stepping back from the flying and recruiting a second pilot in his place. He was 43 years old. He was tired. He had a daughter in middle school whose recitals he kept missing. He told Boswell he wanted to be done by the spring of 2011. He did not get to spring. The investigation that ended Randall Starcher's flying career began, like most aviation smuggling cases, on the ground. It did not begin with a radar track or an intercept or a search at a checkpoint. It began with a fuel receipt. In March of 2010, an analyst at a Homeland Security Investigations field office in McAllen, Texas, was reviewing routine subpoenaed records from a chain of FBO fuel providers along the Texas Gulf Coast. The analyst was looking for a different aircraft, registered to a different suspect, in an unrelated case. While running tail number queries through the fuel transaction database, she noticed a repeating entry that did not match her target, but that struck her as anomalous on its own merits. A 1976 Cessna 206, registered to a Florida shell entity, had purchased fuel at 3 different South Texas airports across a 4-month period in late 2009. Each fuel purchase was made within 24 hours of a corresponding fuel purchase by the same aircraft at airports along the central Gulf Coast, Mississippi, Louisiana, the Florida Panhandle. The pattern repeated: Texas, Gulf Coast, Florida, then Florida, Gulf Coast, Texas. The aircraft was making round trips with no obvious commercial purpose between South Texas and Central Florida. The analyst flagged the file. It was assigned to a special agent named Daniel Holcomb, a 14-year HSI veteran who had worked aviation smuggling cases since the agency had still been called Customs. Holcomb pulled the registration. He pulled the bill of sale. He saw the cash purchase. He pulled the shell entity's filings and found that the company had been registered in Florida just 3 weeks before the aircraft transaction and had never filed a tax return or generated any other business activity. The pattern was unmistakable. Holcomb opened a formal case file in April of 2010. What followed was 8 months of patient ground-based investigation. HSY agents pulled fuel receipts going back to the date of purchase. They pulled flight plans where they existed and reconstructed flight paths where they did not, using a combination of FAA radar archives and airport surveillance footage. They identified the Cessna's recurring departure airport in Central Florida, Kissimmee Gateway, and they identified the pilot. They photographed Randall Starcher in the parking lot of the Kissimmee FBO. They photographed him fueling the Cessna. They photographed him departing on a flight in October of 2010 that radar tracked all the way to a small airfield in South Texas, where local agents photographed the same Cessna sitting on the ramp the following morning. Stories like this are exactly why this channel exists. The system has soft spots: a private plane, a clean pilot's license, a bag of cash. If you want to see more cases where the people we trusted to follow the rules turned that trust into a weapon, subscribe and stick around. We've got the courtroom coming up, and the sentence is heavier than you think. By December of 2010, HSI had built a case file thick enough to take to the United States Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Florida. The file included roughly 2 years of fuel records, surveillance photographs from 4 states, FAA radar reconstructions of multiple round-trip flights, financial records showing that neither Starcher nor Boswell had legitimate income sources sufficient to explain their cash flow, and statements from 2 cooperating informants inside the Texas side distribution network who had identified the Cessna and the pilot by physical description. A federal grand jury sitting in Orlando returned a sealed indictment in early January of 2011. The charge was conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute marijuana in violation of Title 21, United States Code, Sections 841 and 846. The indictment named Starcher, Boswell, and 3 other co-conspirators in the Texas side network. It listed 23 overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy, including each of the 10 documented round-trip flights, the cash purchase of the aircraft, and the receipt of payments by Starcher in Central Florida. Federal agents executed search warrants on the morning of January 26, 2011. One team went to Boswell's residence in Lakeland. A second team went to the leased hangar at Kissimmee Gateway Airport, where the Cessna 206 was tied down. A third team went to the Starcher residence on a quiet cul-de-sac in Kissimmee, where Randall Starcher had been home for less than 72 hours after returning from what would turn out to be his final flight. In the hangar, agents recovered the Cessna 206 itself, the handwritten spiral-bound flight log that Starcher had kept in the map pocket, fuel receipts dating back 19 months, and a set of cargo straps in the rear cabin that forensic analysis later determined had absorbed trace amounts of cannabis residue consistent with the bulk packaging of marijuana. In the Starcher residence, agents recovered approximately $11,000 in cash in a shoebox in a bedroom closet, 3 additional small notebooks documenting flight times and fuel calculations, and a prepaid cellular telephone that had been used exclusively for communications with Boswell over the preceding 22 months. The phone's call log showed 146 calls and 311 text messages, all to and from a single number that also turned out to be a prepaid phone, registered to no one, purchased at a convenience store in Lakeland. The text messages were short and operational. They did not use the word marijuana. They used the word boxes. Boswell, July 14th, 2009. Boxes ready for pickup Wednesday. Starcher, July 14th, 2009. Wednesday works. Same place? Boswell, July 14th, 2009. Same place. 300 on top. Starcher, July 14th, 2009. Copy. 300 on top meant $300 over the standard rate for that particular load. There were 41 similar exchanges across the prepaid phone's call log, each one referring to boxes and pickup, and the place and the plane. Taken individually, none of them was incriminating. Taken together, they were a complete operational record of a smuggling enterprise. The arrest itself happened on the front lawn of the Starcher home at 6:47 in the morning. The cul-de-sac was quiet. The grass was still wet with overnight dew. Randall Starcher was wearing a gray t-shirt and pajama pants when he answered the front door. He had a cup of coffee in his right hand. Special Agent Daniel Holcomb stood on the front step with 2 other HSI agents and a uniformed Kissimmee Police Department officer behind him. Holcomb identified himself, displayed his credentials, and informed Starcher that he was under arrest pursuant to a federal indictment. Starcher did not run. He did not protest. He did not act surprised. The body cam footage from the Kissimmee officer's chest-mounted camera captured the exchange in full. Holcomb: Mr. Starcher, are you Randall Clayton Starcher? Starcher: I am. Holcomb: Sir, we have a federal warrant for your arrest. The charge is conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute marijuana. Do you understand? Starcher: I understand. Holcomb. Is there anyone else in the house? Starcher. My wife. My kids are at school. My wife is upstairs. Holcomb. I'm going to ask you to set the coffee down on the steps, sir, and turn around with your hands behind your back. Starcher. Can I tell my wife? Holcomb. An officer will speak with her. Set the coffee down, please. Starcher set the coffee cup on the front step. He turned around. He looked across the lawn at the unmarked sedans parked along the curb. He looked at the agent's vehicle that was already blocking the driveway. He looked for what the body cam showed to be roughly 4 seconds at the neighbor's window across the cul-de-sac where a curtain had moved. Then he said, quietly, I figured this was going to happen eventually. He did not say anything else. He did not ask for a lawyer at that moment. He did not protest the cuffs. He walked down the front steps and into the back of the sedan with his head down. The body cam captured his wife in the doorway behind him, in a bathrobe, watching her husband be put into the back of a federal vehicle on a Wednesday morning in January. Randall Starcher was arraigned in the federal courthouse in Orlando the following afternoon. He was represented by a court-appointed attorney named Catherine Mendoza, a former assistant public defender who had moved into private practice 3 years earlier. Mendoza was, by all accounts, a careful and pragmatic lawyer. She read the indictment, she read the evidence inventory from the search warrants, she listened to the prepaid phone recordings the government had compiled, and she gave her client a single piece of professional advice. She told him to plead. The evidence was overwhelming. The flight logs in Starcher's own handwriting documented every trip. The fuel receipts corroborated every leg. The radar reconstructions traced every flight path. The phone records connected him to Boswell on the dates of every load. The Cessna itself, sitting in an HSI evidence hangar in Tampa, had been purchased with cash that the government could trace through bank records to marijuana proceeds, which meant the aircraft was forfeitable as proceeds of the offense, regardless of how the criminal case resolved. The plea agreement was finalized in August of 2011. Starcher pleaded guilty to a single count of conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute marijuana. He agreed to forfeit the Cessna 206. He agreed to cooperate against Boswell, who had not pleaded and who was preparing to take his own case to trial. In exchange, the government agreed to recommend a sentence at the low end of the applicable guidelines range. Sentencing was set for December 14, 2011. The hearing was held in the courtroom of the Honorable Gregory Patterson, a senior district judge who had sat on the Middle District bench for 21 years. The courtroom was almost empty. Randall Starcher's wife sat in the second row. His son, 15 years old, sat next to her. His daughter, 12, had been left at home. Assistant United States Attorney Patricia Lindstrom presented the government's sentencing recommendation. She walked the court through the scale of the conspiracy.